All right, welcome. I've been wanting to do this for a little while, is to go through uh, Mortimer Adler's book called How to Think About Great Ideas. This book covers 54 different ideas that are considered great and have been talked about in the great books of the Western world. So what we'll do is we'll go through each of these. Today, we're going to talk about truth and the importance of talking about truth. It's probably a great place to start when you're thinking about ideas, because one of the questions someone might ask is, can we actually know truth? In fact, that's the first kind of person who comes to the truth claims. I call these people truth seekers. There's different groups of people have their different stances on truth. And the first is the skeptic. They believe that we cannot know truth, anything about truth, or anything that is true, to say that it is true or not true. They just remain skeptical, not about some things, but about everything. That's how skeptical they are. The next group of people is the relativist. These people think that, well, this is true for me, but it may not necessarily be true for you. And if it doesn't have any sort of correspondence, if there's no corroboratingness to them, then that's fine. That's just the way it's going to be. But I have my truth and you have your truth. The next person is, they come to truth and they think that, yes, we can know what truth is. And the reason how we know truth and what truth is it works. So we know what truth is because it works. And that is their view. They're the pragmatists' view. This is from like the philosopher William James and others that have come along to say that this is how we know truth, by what works. And that's a pretty helpful way of looking at truth. I don't think it's the full truth of the matter, but it's helpful enough. But I think what we should do now, instead of just talking about those who talk about truth, rather let's look at defining truth and what it means. One of the great ways that classical writers would write is that they would always begin with defining their terms and spending a lot of time talking about what terms or what a term actually means. So when we say the truth of something, or what is truth, what does that even mean? That's a really good question. And I think sometimes what's helpful here is not to necessarily define what truth is, but what is truth not? In other words, a lie. I think all of us recognize that lies exist. We do, in fact, lie. And so what is that? What is a lie? Mortimer Adler asked this really great question in the book. He asked this in this chapter on truth. He says, can a person lie deliberately without at least thinking he knows something to be true, that he has some grasp of the truth? This is a pretty interesting question for a skeptic. If someone you meet that's a skeptic who doesn't think we have any truth claims, to ask them a question like, well, can a person tell a lie if we don't know what truth is? What's the difference between a truth and a lie if that's just how things are? And then Aristotle, then, to talk about truth and lies, is to say it this way. He writes very short about this, but there's a lot to unpack and to think about. So he says, talking about truth, he says, to say what is that it is, or what is not that it is not, is to speak the truth or to think truly. Just as it is false to say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is. And so to speak truly is to speak what it is, that things are. And to not speak truthfully is to say what is, and to say that what is actually not. It's an interesting way of defining truth. And so as we kind of summarize all of this, what is truth? Truth is the correspondence between the mind and reality. When we grasp the reality around us with our minds accurately, where there's correspondence between what we think and what is out there in reality, that's what the truth is. And Plato, kind of going along with Aristotle, says this about false propositions or false statements. He says, a false proposition is one which asserts the non-existence of things which are, or the existence of things which are not. So very similar to what Aristotle would describe it. And then coming along after him, we have Aquinas, who says, or Thomas Aquinas, who says, truth in the human mind consists in the mind's conformity to reality. So there's that connection between our minds and reality. As long as that is clear, that that is right and sound, then we are speaking truthfully. And that's one of the things that you and I do when we talk to one another, trying to find the truth about something. It's what we have to engage with our minds to converse to one another. The words that I say have to have some meaning to you, and you have to understand them in a certain way, and then you then relay those back to me as if you understand what I'm saying. And we go back and forth, and it can take a while to get the actual truth of things. And a lot of times we're just working on inference there, but we can be specific about how we talk to one another. And as we do that, we're getting closer and closer to the truth on what each other is thinking, or the truth about some sort of subject we're discussing. And so as long as our minds are consistent with reality, then that's how we know what the truth is. Now, you probably have seen a big problem when it comes to truth, because here's the question then. Can we test truth? Right? In a lab, you can run experiments and you can weigh things and you can measure things and all those things. But truth itself, can we test truth? How do we know what we think we know is the truth is, in fact, the truth? This is a sticky problem. This is a really tough one, because the thing that we're testing to think it is true is our minds themselves. How do we know what our mind thinks is actually true? This problem can be illustrated with thinking about like a measuring tape. If you have a measuring tape, and your measuring tape that you have, the tick marks, the inches, the quarter inches, the 3/8, and all that stuff, if that's off, how would you know? You wouldn't know unless you're comparing it to some sort of known, absolute, trusting tape measure somewhere else. And so what if our minds are that tape measure where the tick marks are off? How do we know that our tape measurer, our minds, are accurate? That's the big problem of knowing truth. Because, you probably have heard this idea before, but imagine, how do you know that you are not some thing in a simulation where the beings that have put you in this simulation have just stuck all your memories in your mind 10 seconds ago, and they feel like they're old. They feel like you have a lot of history, but in fact, you're only, 10 seconds old. How do you test that? How do you not know that that's true or not? Those are those kind of questions that are we might struggle with if you spend a lot of time thinking about how do we know truth. But the way that the classic writers, the philosophers, would come to truth is this. Number one, there are several known things that we can grasp simply by our reason. In other words, these things are just self-evident. From these self-evident truths that we know are to be true, then we use our perception to gain more knowledge. And we hold up our perception against what we know to be true, and we use that to continue to increase in our knowledge of what is in fact true. That's how mathematics works, right? You begin with addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and from there you begin to expand upon more knowledge, and you learn things like exponents or dividing certain things that you wouldn't think would be dividable, but based upon the math, it all checks out and it's repeatable. And so that's one way of gaining truth. And that's a great way of doing it. Aristotle then laid down at least 3 different laws when it comes to logic or knowing truth. And we'll look at those and we'll get out of here. The first is this: the law of identity. A is A. This kind of goes back to this big idea of truth being immutable, that once one thing is true, it is always true. Now you might say, well, that doesn't make sense. If I got $100 in my bank account, it's true that I have $100. Well, what about tomorrow when I have $50 in my account because I went spending? Then you might say, no. It was true yesterday that you had $50 or $100 in your bank account, but not today. You only have 50. So it was true then, and it is still true even the next day, but you have to modify it because it was only true for a certain amount of time back then, but that statement is still a true statement to say that yesterday I had $100 in my bank account, even though today you might have 50. So the law of identity, A is A. Whatever the thing it is, it has to be the same thing. So it might take a while to really grasp that, but A is A. In other words, $5 is $5. 7 cents is 7 cents. Those things they just never change. The next idea is the law of non-contradiction. And that is if A, so again, we're just using kind of math variables here. If A equals B and, better way to say this is this. A equals B and A does not equal B cannot be true at the same time. In other words, things cannot contradict themselves. If something is true, and then it can't never be like not true. So law of non-contradiction is a great one to think about. Things cannot contradict logically. So that one, if you run up against that problem, then you know that there's something wrong with your thinking or something wrong with the data you have, and you got to refresh how you think. The last one is the law of excluded middle. So this is another one kind of hard to wrap your mind around unless you're thinking just simply logically, right? A, as a variable, must either be true or false. So A cannot be true and false at the same time. It has to be either true or false. So those are 3 laws of logic. There's some others that have been developed later, but for right now, those things are good. So when it comes to thinking about truth, we have to think about what we know to be self-evident, the self-evident truths like are written down for us, as well as how do we take in from our perceptions what is true. And our perception is not just what we see, hear, taste, and touch and all that and smell, but it's also our perception is how we think, because there's many things that we know, not simply because we have tasted, smelled, or whatever, but we have grasped them with our mind's perception through thinking. So that's how to think, beginningly, how to think about truth. Next time we're going to look at opinion and how opinion differs from truth. Thanks for watching.